Welcome to Boring Pastimes *. Tonight, we drift far beyond the rush of modern life, to where stories glow gently in the hearth-light of memory. You're listening to boring Greek myths for sleep, where forgotten tales warm the quiet spaces of your mind. In this story, we'll meet Hestia, goddess of the hearth, keeper of flame, and perhaps the most peaceful figure in all of Olympus. There are no battles here, no storms or curses, only the gentle crackle of firelight and the story of how the very first cozy hearth was lit. So close your eyes, rest your hands, and let your thoughts grow soft. The story begins now. Story 12. The surprisingly long life of a Roman public bathroom. Section 1. Marble seats and morning routines. The early morning light filtered through the crumbling archways of the Roman latrina. The public bathroom, just off the forum, you can almost hear the faint shuffle of sandals against mosaic floors, the low murmur of conversation between senators and shopkeepers, and the soft splash of water from the stone basin in the corner. It is not the Colosseum, nor the Senate House, but herein the quiet, tiled corner of Roman civilization, the empire sat down, quite literally, to take care of its most human needs. The Roman public latrina was not a place of privacy or shame. In fact, it was the opposite. You would have found rows of smooth marble seats lined in perfect symmetry, each with a modest keyhole opening beneath. Beneath the seats, a steady flow of water carried away waste, fed by the ingenious aqueduct systems Rome had engineered for a society so obsessed with order, hygiene, and communal life. The public toilet was simply another extension of civic duty. It was a space as social as the bathhouse, and as mundane as it was essential. You might imagine that the patrons of the latrina preferred silence or solitude, but in truth, it was the chatter that filled the room. Discussions of politics, the price of grain, or the behavior of a new tribune all floated between the stone walls. These bathrooms, often built near marketplaces, forums, or public baths, were where the news spread, where rumors fermented, and where people quite literally sat with one another, side by side, with no partition between them. Each latrina was carefully constructed. Alongside the row of seats ran a small trough of running water, clean water that is not for drinking, but for rinsing the sponge. The spongionistic, called a tersorium, was Rome's solution to toilet paper. Communal. In nature, it was stored in vinegar water and shared between users. To the modern mind, this might feel disconcerting, but in ancient Rome, where the focus was on the flow and purity of water, the constant rinsing was thought to maintain hygiene. Beneath the latrina, a system of clay pipes and stone channels led the waste away from the city into larger sewers like the Cloaca Maxima. The engineering was precise, gravity-fed water systems ensured that nothing remained stagnant. The latrina functioned not merely as a receptacle, but as a well-oiled part of the Roman urban machine. Maintenance workers, known as foricari, would tend to these spaces daily, scrubbing the marble, adjusting flow rates, and ensuring that nothing obstructed the pipes. But what makes these bathrooms truly remarkable is not just their function, it's their endurance. Some of them, like those in Ostia Antica and Herculaneum, have survived millennia. The stones are still smooth from centuries of sitting, the mosaics faded but present. The structures remain a quiet testament to Rome's obsession with infrastructure and civic pride, even in ruins. They suggest a city that knew how to handle its mess quietly, efficiently, and with surprising dignity. Imagine yourself walking past one of these latrines in the 2nd century CE. You'd hear a laugh echoing against the marble, a senator discussing grain tariffs while relieving himself. You might see a child learning how to use the sponge properly from his elder, or a merchant counting his coins while discussing the reliability of the new aqueduct channel. These bathrooms were not hiding places, they were civic centers in their own strange way. They even held spiritual significance. Small household deities, called lares, were sometimes placed near the latrines for protection, and inscriptions dedicated to Clocina, the goddess of sewers and purification, were common. Cleanliness was godliness, even here, where it seemed least sacred. But the Romans, in their detailed and pragmatic way, sanctified even the most mundane moments of daily life. The latrines also reveal a subtle layer of social structure. Though open to all free citizens, not all bathrooms were created equal. Elite latrines like those attached to private villas, or the more ornate ones found in bathhouses, might be decorated with frescoes, lined with polished stone, or positioned for better airflow. Common latrines near markets or barracks were more functional, often darker, and more utilitarian, yet all shared the same purpose: to support a city of over 1 million people with something as basic and essential as sanitation. In times of civic celebration or mourning, the latrines remained open. Their flow never ceased. During festivals, extra efforts were made to keep them clean, and during plague years, rituals of purification included cleaning the sewers and burning herbs near latrine entrances. Rome understood that health began below, street level, and yet, as central as they were, the latrines rarely made it into history's grand narratives. They weren't immortalized like battles or emperors, but perhaps that is what makes them so valuable to us now. In the silence of these stone chambers, there is a record, not of conquest, but of community, not of speeches, but of murmured confessions and casual debates. The everyday rhythm of a civilization is carved into these cold marble seats. Today, archaeologists study ancient latrines not just for their architecture, but for what lies beneath. Layers of sediment hold microscopic remnants of ancient diets: fig seeds, fish bones, barley husks, parasites, and bacteria reveal the health of the people who once used them. Even coins, accidentally dropped and never retrieved, offer clues to the economic habits of the common Roman dot. So why do we still talk about these bathrooms 2,000 years later? Because they worked long after empires rose and fell. After roads crumbled and temples toppled, many of these latrines kept functioning. The water still flowed in some cases. The waste still washed away. For generations, they remained usable proof of a civilization that believed public hygiene was not just practical, but essential. What does it say about a people that they invested such care into a place meant for waste? Perhaps that they understood something. We forget that the health of a city is not measured in its triumphal arches or gilded statues, but in the quiet flow of water beneath our feet. And so the question remains, what else did the Romans build to last, quietly humming beneath the grandeur of the empire, hidden from history's spotlight, but vital to its survival? Section 2, Goddess of the Drain, Rome's Sacred Sewers. You might not have noticed her, even if you'd passed her every morning. A modest statue, weather-worn and tucked beside the public latrina's arch. Her features faded, her robes chipped, but her gaze steady, watching over the water's endless journey. This was Closina, Rome's forgotten goddess of the sewer, purification, and all that flows away. It may surprise you that Rome had such a deity at all. After all, she wasn't cast in golden shrines or invoked in epic poems. She was never celebrated in triumphal marches or hailed by emperors. But Closina, cloaked in humility, held a unique role in the daily cleanliness of a sprawling empire. You see, in Rome, the sacred was not divorced from the sewer, ran alongside it. Long before the marble seats of the latrina were ever polished, the Cloaca Maxima had already begun its silent work. This grand sewer, the largest and oldest in the empire, was first carved in the 6th century BCE under the reign of Rome's kings. It began not as a sophisticated tunnel, but as a ditch carved by Etruscan hands to drain the marshy Forum Valley. Over time, it was paved, bricked, and arched. Before long, it became one of Rome's most vital arteries. Imagine it, a vaulted channel beneath the city, wide enough to walk through in parts, dark and echoing, with the gentle stream of waste and water coursing from homes, fountains, baths, and latrines. This sewer connected the city's daily life, its cooking pots, its laundry, its waste, into a grand system that emptied into the Tiber River. It was not beautiful, but it was essential. The Cloaca Maxima was maintained not just by engineers, but by ritual. Offerings were made to Closina, the spirit of the flow. Small flowers, bronze trinkets, and sometimes coins were tossed into the grates above the sewer entrances. In the Forum itself, a small shrine once stood, half forgotten now, where lovers whispered prayers for purification and matrons asked that their households stay healthy. To the Romans, water was a gift of the gods, but only clean water held power. And so they built elaborate systems to separate the pure from the foul. The aqueducts brought fresh water from hills and springs. The latrines and baths used it. The cloaca carried it all away. It was a cycle, carefully maintained, deeply respected. Closina watched over this entire process, not from a grand temple, but from a nook near the city's dirtiest work. By the 1st century CE, the sewer system under Rome had expanded into a complex web. There were main channels, like the Cloaca Maxima, but also dozens of smaller cloaca, winding beneath tenement housing, markets, temples, and even palaces. These were cleaned and inspected regularly. City slaves and hired workers, often called suburani, or those of the underside, ventured into these dark veins with torches, scraping buildup, repairing bricks, and sometimes retrieving items that had fallen through the drains above. One recorded account tells of a gold ring recovered after slipping from a senator's fingers into the Forum's basin. The sewer worker who returned it was given a loaf of bread, a pat on the back, and a coin, along with a rather embarrassed thank you above ground. Water inspectors, curators, aquarium ensured that everything flowed as it should. They checked for blockages, adjusted flow gates, and oversaw the construction of newer tunnels as the city grew. It was a mark of prestige to serve in this office, for it placed you at the heart of Rome's survival, quiet, unseen, but essential. Even emperors took notice. Augustus praised the city's sewer system in his records. Pliny the Elder wrote of its grandeur. marveling that entire wagons could pass through parts of it. He called it one of the world's great marvels, not for its appearance, but for its persistence. Despite their engineering, though, the sewers were not immune to trouble. In rainy seasons, water could rise quickly, backing up through the drains and flooding homes. In drier times, sediment built up, clogging the flow. Sometimes, animals, snakes, rats, or frogs found their way up from the drains, startling those in latrines or kitchens. To calm fears and restore purity, Rome turned again to ritual. Herbs were burned near key sewer grates. Ceremonies were held in early spring when floods were most common. In one rite, a goat was sacrificed, not for grandeur, but as a plea. May the waters move freely. May Closina protect what lies beneath. Some believed that foul smells were a warning from the gods. Others saw them as signs of imbalance in the city, and so incense was burned near sewer vents, especially in wealthier districts. Clay tablets found near Pompeii describe mixtures of rosemary, sage, and laurel used in such rituals, faint perfumes in the presence of something deeply practical. And all the while, the latrines remained open. The water ran, the people sat, spoke, cleaned, and left, never thinking twice about what happened beneath them. But you, now, can see it, the long, slow work of a city beneath its own feet. As Rome aged, the sewers aged with it. Repairs were constant. Some tunnels collapsed and were rebuilt. Others shifted course, redirected by newer buildings or changing hillsides. But even as emperors came and went, the Cloaca Maxima endured in later centuries. As the empire weakened, the sewer system held on. Barbarians crossed the borders, statues fell, libraries burned, but the latrines still drained. The engineers dwindled, the rituals faded, but the water still knew where to go. The goddess of the drain had long outlasted the kings and consuls, who once built her shrine. Even in the early medieval period, when much of Rome was in ruin, travelers wrote of water still flowing beneath the broken city. The bathhouses were empty, the colonnades cracked, but in the tunnels, life quietly continued. Perhaps the most astonishing truth is that parts of this ancient system still function today. Modern archaeologists and civil engineers, exploring beneath the streets of Rome, have found intact sections of the Cloaca Maxima, still channeling water as they did over 2,000 years ago. Moss grows on the bricks, light filters through iron grates, coins glint at the bottom of slow eddies. It is, in its own way, eternal. So now, as you picture those smooth marble latrines above, remember that every seat, every sponge, every whispered conversation relied on the careful, sacred flow below. That behind every clean basin stood a goddess with no temple, only tunnels, and that Rome, for all its triumphs and battles, owed part of its survival to her, the one who carried everything away. But what happened when the flow stopped, when the drains no longer cleared and the water stood still? What did it mean for the people above? Section 3. The drain that outlived the empire. You might think the end of an empire would come with flames, trumpets, or the crash of falling marble. But in Rome, it came slower, not in battlefields or burning libraries, but in puddles, stagnant ones, the kind that gather in corners, ignored, when no one checks the drain anymore. The Roman Empire's fall didn't happen overnight, and neither did the decline of its sewers. The Cloaca Maxima Once the silent artery of the world's greatest city didn't collapse with fanfare. It simply kept flowing until it didn't. By the 5th century CE, as imperial authority crumbled and the Western Empire fractured, the grand network of aqueducts, fountains, and sewer channels began to break down. It started small, a cracked tile here, a misaligned stone there. The slaves and workers who once maintained the underground tunnels were no longer paid. The officials who oversaw repairs had fled, been reassigned, or were killed. The rituals to Closina fell silent. The grates clogged still. The water tried to run. You can imagine it, gurgling under debris, trickling past fallen leaves and bits of broken pottery. A city trying to breathe through blocked lungs. Above ground, the latrines began to change. Some were abandoned. Moss grew across the marble seats. Wild dogs found shelter beneath the overhangs. Grass pushed through once pristine mosaics. The social space of Rome's communal bathrooms, once alive with conversation, grew quiet. And yet, the bones of the structures remained, even after the Ostrogoths entered the city. And the lights of Roman administration dimmed. These public toilets lingered, not because people respected them, but because no one bothered to dismantle them. They had been built too well. Travelers from the East, visiting centuries after the fall, reported stumbling upon intact latrines, still aligned, still smooth, still unmistakably Roman in some quarters. People continued to use them long after the water had stopped. Buckets replaced flowing fountains. The sponge was gone, replaced with rags or leaves, and the sewer below. It had become unpredictable. In some parts of the city, it overflowed. In others, it dried completely. Imagine the silence of those ancient tunnels, now once echoing with flowing water and booted feet, now holding only dust or the drip of distant rain. Bats nesting in corners, the faint smell of earth and memory. The goddess Closina had not left, but she was waiting, her shrine buried beneath layers of time. Still, some parts of the system survived. A few aqueducts continued to carry water into the city's broken heart, enough to sustain a reduced population. A bishop might commission repairs for a well. A noble family might clear a private channel. But the citywide coordination, the system that once cleaned 1 million lives each day, was gone. And yet, through this quiet decay, the legacy of Rome's sewer lived on. Centuries later, when medieval Rome rose from the fragments of its ancient past, people began to rediscover the tunnels, not as worshippers or citizens, but as scavengers, farmers and masons, digging for stone, stumbled into the dark underground vaults. The bricks were reused, the pipes broken and melted down, and yet, in some places, the system was simply left untouched. By the time the Renaissance breathed new life into the study of Roman antiquity, the Cloaca Maxima had become a curiosity again. Artists and scholars from Florence and beyond traveled to see it. They called it the mysterious drain, a relic of a forgotten genius. Some even ventured inside, lanterns in hand, sketching the arches and tracing the paths of water, long gone. What they found amazed them. Brickwork that still held, vaulted ceilings with no mortar failures, sediment packed tightly but not crumbling. A system that had once spanned miles, now forgotten but intact. One artist in the 1500s called it a cathedral for the water that once flowed with purpose. During this time, Rome began to build again. New fountains, new drains, new systems, but always with an eye on what had come before. They reused what they could, and sometimes, when digging, they found the old latrines. Some were fully buried. Others had been repurposed as wine cellars, animal shelters, even storage rooms. And still, below it all, the Cloaca Maxima remained. By the 19th century, Rome's modernization brought the engineers back. City planners, inspired by the Industrial Revolution, sought to map every tunnel. When they did, they were stunned. More than 2 millennia after its creation, parts of the ancient sewer were still usable. In fact, in some districts, the Cloaca Maxima still formed the backbone of modern drainage. Modern Rome built on ancient Rome still drains through pieces of the past. It's a strange legacy, isn't it? We speak often of emperors, poets, and generals, of grand arenas and sacred temples, but the longest-lasting achievement of Rome may be this: a public bathroom, a toilet seat of marble, a sewer that refused to die. In recent years, archaeologists have uncovered even more of the system. Latrines near Pompeii and Herculaneum show striking similarities to those in Britain, Gaul, and North Africa, clear proof that Rome exported this part of its life, along with its language and law. In Bath, England, Roman toilets still lie beneath the modern spa. In Tunisia, near Douga, latrine mosaics depict dolphins and sea creatures, decoration for a place of waste. In Turkey, the ancient city of Ephesus holds one of the most preserved multi-seat latrines in the empire, where visitors today still sit, puzzled, wondering at the openness of it all. But Rome did not see it as strange. It saw it as civic, practical, necessary, and perhaps that's the secret. The empire rose with ambition, but it lasted through infrastructure, through the things no one glorifies: drains, stones, pipes, flow. The empire's buildings fell, but the water still knew where to go. So, when you think of Rome, perhaps don't picture the chariot races or marble gods. Instead, imagine the slow trickle beneath your feet, the steady channel carrying away the forgotten, the marble seat cool in the morning shade, the sponge in vinegar, the soft murmur of two strangers talking about the weather as they sit side by side. Because, in the end, what survived wasn't the spectacle, it was the system. And beneath that system, still waiting, still watching, sits a quiet goddess with a chipped nose and faded robe, Closina, mother of the drain, patroness of purification, long overlooked but never truly gone. Perhaps she's watching still. Story 2. Why Georgian women sniffed vinegar before parties. Section 1. Bottles on the mantel, the secret sense of a Georgian drawing room. The light in the drawing room was soft that evening, filtered through lace curtains and catching on the polished silver bell by the hearth. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender water, and something sharper, almost sour. You might not notice it at first, but if you sat still long enough, you'd catch it. The tang of vinegar, faint and clinging. It drifted not from the kitchen, but from the glass bottle resting delicately on the mantelpiece, stoppered in crystal and wrapped in ribbon. It was not a cleaning supply. It was not a mistake. It was a fashion in the Georgian Iroquois parlors. In London, Bath, and country estates alike, it was considered both stylish and necessary for a lady to carry a small vial of scented vinegar. These were not the vinegar bottles you might imagine. used for dressing lettuce or preserving onions. No, these were vinaigrettes, delicate, perfumed, and purposeful, worn like jewelry, held like a secret. You see, the world outside those powdery drawing rooms was far less fragrant. The streets of 18th century England and much of Europe reeked of damp refuse, chamber pots, coal smoke, and rotting food. Perfume could mask the scent of a person, but it could not hold back the city. So Georgian women and, later, gentlemen, too turned to vinegar, infused with herbs and essential oils. As a remedy, they carried it in tiny silver cases lined with sponge, which could be discreetly opened and held beneath the nose. Just a gentle sniff, enough to push back the worst of the world. These were known as smelling salts, though they contained no ammonia-only sharp herbal vinegar designed to refresh the senses, clear the head, and restore composure. Some were shaped like lockets, worn on silk ribbons around the neck. Others hid in reticules, among fans and lace gloves. A few rested openly on side tables, meant to be admired as much as used. The vinaigrettes themselves were miniature works of art, engraved, filigreed, chased in gold. Owning a fine one was a subtle display of taste and means. But there was another reason these scented vinegars were kept so close. Not just for odor, but for fainting. Georgian society was tightly laced, literally. Corsets pulled tight over linen chemises, layered with petticoats, embroidered bodices, and powdered wigs. A fashionable woman might spend over an hour preparing her attire, every ribbon and ringlet placed just so. But all this beauty came at a price: shallow breaths, overheated skin, and, at times, dizziness. In such moments, standing for hours at a crowded salon, dancing in a stuffy ballroom, sitting beside a roaring fire in layers of brocade faintness was not uncommon. To swoon was not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it was a mark of refinement. But to recover quickly, that required preparation. The vinaigrette, with its sharp tang, served as both antidote and accessory. You can imagine the scene: a young lady pale from heat, a gentleman rushing to her side, a silver vinaigrette opened with care and held beneath her nose. She breathes in deeply, a pause, a flutter of eyelashes, and then, as though on cue, she returns to herself, restored, composed, and politely apologetic. There were even etiquette guides on how to revive a lady without impropriety. One must never touch her too much. One must not lift her skirts. And one must never, ever apply water directly to her face unless truly necessary. Vinegar was the safe choice. Respectful, refined, and just strong enough to bring a lady back from the edge. Doctors, too, had their opinions. In an age where miasmith, the invisible bad airs, were blamed for everything from colds to cholera, vinegar was seen as a purifier. Hospitals used it to cleanse wounds. Households soaked cloths in it during outbreaks. Travelers poured it onto the floors of carriages. And in upper-class circles, vinaigrettes became a protective charm against both social embarrassment and invisible illness. The recipes varied. Some women favored lavender and rosemary. Others preferred cinnamon and clove. A few daringly added hints of camphor or bergamot. But the base was always the same: good vinegar wine or cider, never malt distilled and strained, then steeped with dried herbs. The result was both medicinal and personal, tailored to taste. In Bath, The fashionable elite would visit apothecaries for their own signature blends. Shopkeepers offered shelves lined with ornate bottles, labeled in looping script, vinegar a la duchesse, the ladies' reviving elixir, lemon balm for the faint of heart. Prices varied, of course. A simple bottle might cost a few shillings. A custom-crafted vinaigrette inlaid with mother-of-pearl, several pounds, and a name in the gossip papers. It became a ritual. Before stepping into a carriage, a lady might dab a drop behind each ear. Before entering a party, she might check her bottle, adjust her gloves, and breathe in the comfort of something sharp and familiar. It steadied the nerves. It masked the world. It was her shield, and it wasn't just the women. Gentlemen carried vinaigrettes, tooth more discreetly. A fop might pull one from his waistcoat, inhaling before stepping into a crowded club. A politician might use one during a long debate, masking the smell of sweat and ink. Even soldiers were known to keep a sponge bottle tucked into their packs, the scent of rosemary and vinegar reminding them of home. But no one displayed them, quite like the women of the Georgian drawing rooms. There, nestled beside fans, opera glasses, and sachets of dried rose petals, the vinaigrette reigned, elegant, understated, a symbol of refinement in an unrefined world. And so it lingered, a whisper of vinegar on the air, a flash of silver in a gloved hand, a faint, sharp scent amid powder and perfume. Why did they sniff vinegar before parties? Because it kept them upright, because it masked what society preferred not to see, because beauty, it seemed, required a little discomfort, and because, beneath all the lace and etiquette, the women of the Georgian era knew how to survive quietly, gracefully, and with a bottle hidden in plain sight. But what happened when vinegar wasn't enough? When the world outside grew fouler? Then scent could disguise, and fainting became not a fashion, but a warning. Section 2. The bottles beneath the lace. The drawing room shimmered with candlelight. Above, chandeliers hung like frozen fountains, and below, parquet floors gleamed under slippered feet. Women in silks and powdered hair moved like clouds, their laughter soft and practiced, their fans flicking in and out of conversation. But beneath every bodice, somewhere tucked discreetly into a ribbon or stitched carefully inside a sleeve, rested a small glass vial, delicate, cool, and sharp, the vinegar bottle, a secret kept close. The bottles were called vinaigrettes, and they were not quite perfumes, made of silver or gilt, and often engraved with fine floral etchings. These little treasures held a sponge soaked in aromatic vinegar, sometimes with lavender, cloves, rosemary, or cinnamon oil. The scent was brisk and biting, meant not to seduce but to awaken. It was, oddly, a weapon against fainting, a dainty act of practicality hidden in a world of frills. Why did they faint so often, those Georgian ladies? The answers are layered like the petticoats they wore. Tight corsets were partly to blame. The organs compressed, lungs restricted, and breaths came shallow. Dancing, long hours of standing, and the sweltering air of crowded salons conspired to topple even the most graceful. But fainting was also a language, a kind of social choreography. A swoon could excuse a poorly timed comment or draw a gallant escort from the crowd. A sniff of vinegar cut through the haze. When a lady's vision blurred or her temples throbbed, she'd reach discreetly into her reticule or bodice and retrieve The vinaigrette, just one whiff, could jolt her like a splash of cold water to the senses. The scent was acrid, not unpleasant, but not sweet either. It demanded presence. It whispered, "Don't collapse just yet." Some vinaigrettes were plain, brass, no larger than a walnut. Others were extravagantly designed, with filigree lids and velvet linings. A few had chains to hang around the neck, like lockets. Though modesty dictated, they remain hidden. Men carried them too, especially physicians and apothecaries. But among fashionable society, the vinaigrette was a silent companion, a tiny rebellion against fragility. Housemaids often made their own. Vinegar infused with herbs or citrus peel would be set in a stopper bottle for the mistress's evening bag. Cheaper versions used cloth soaked in diluted spirit of ammonia, or even sharp wine. The scent varied, but the purpose was always the same: keep upright, keep aware, and never let the room see you falter. In the hushed corners of boudoirs, mothers taught daughters how to faint properly, not with flailing arms, but with grace. Knees bent slightly, head tilted just so, and then how to recover. Fan quickly, murmur apologies, sniff your vinegar, and smile. It was theater, performed in slow motion beneath powdered wigs and rouge. Physicians of the era had mixed opinions. Some believed fainting was an affliction of the overly sensitive, the so-called nervous constitution of women. Others pointed to the stifling gowns, the lack of ventilation, and the sheer weight of expectation. A vinaigrette, they agreed, was at least a harmless treatment, better vinegar than mercury or leeches at parties. Fainting couches became part of the furniture. Placed near fireplaces and under open windows, they waited quietly for their moment. When not in use, they looked like elegant afterthoughts. When occupied, they became stages for whispered concern and gentle revivals. A sniff of vinegar, a glass of cordial, a damp cloth on the wrist. The rituals of revival were as rehearsed as a dance. It wasn't just about health, it was about control. To faint when one wished and recover quickly was to show mastery over one's body in a world that often denied women any. The vinaigrette was both shield and signal. I may look delicate, but I carry what I need. Beneath the lace and laughter, there was steel. Even the scent itself told stories. A vinaigrette passed down from mother to daughter might hold a familiar perfume, rosemary, perhaps like the herb tucked into letters for memory, or cinnamon, warm and bracing, like a reminder of winter hearths. These tiny bottles became heirlooms, their scent outlasting fashion, and still the parties continued. The music swelled, the candles burned low, and the gowns swept across polished floors. Fainting was not weakness, but rhythm. Vinegar, pungent and clean, was the metronome that kept hearts from stumbling. Behind every gloved hand and fluttered fan, a small bottle waited, unseen, unsung, but essential. Section 3. The bottled etiquette, when vinegar meant virtue. The ballroom had long since fallen silent in Charlotte Wexley's memory, yet the scent lingered like a ribbon caught in a drawer, shut but not forgotten. Long after the music had faded and the powdered wigs packed away, she remembered the vinegar first. It had been tucked into a dainty silver vinaigrette, nestled within the folds of her embroidered reticule, the chain clinking softly with every step. Inside the tiny locket-like box lay a sponge, soaked not with perfume but with sharp vinegar tincture, sometimes infused with lavender or rosemary. She'd open it discreetly when the air grew stifling, when sweat mingled too freely with cologne, when the men's breath smelt of port and overcooked pheasant. The vinaigrette was more than defense against odor. It was armor. Society ladies, corseted and starched, walked into candlelit parlors, armed with etiquetted vinegar. To faint gracefully was a skill. To recover without disrupting conversation, an art. The vinaigrette helped them both. A gentle sniff gave the impression of fragility, while anchoring the senses against the smothering warmth of drawing rooms. There was a phrase Charlotte remembered from her finishing tutor: better to revive with vinegar than collapse with sweat. It sounded absurd now, but back then it made sense. It wasn't just about smells. It was about the discipline of appearing composed while one's ribs ached under boning, and breath came in measured sips. Apothecaries of the time sold countless vinegar concoctions. Some were steeped with rose petals, others with crushed mint leaves or thyme. There were even vinegar vapors marketed to young ladies prone to nerves. Not every bottle bore a remedy's label. Some were disguised in filigreed casings and marketed as genteel accessories. The trend had quietly bloomed across the continent. In Parisian salons, they called them vinaigrettes de grace. In Vienna, Duftwasser. The Georgian obsession, though, was most theatrical. Each clink of a vinaigrette chain was part of the evening's choreography. Charlotte once watched Lady Moira of Chelsea pull hers mid-waltz, pretending to stifle a swoon as a duke whispered too close. It was an act rehearsed in mirrors falling gracefully backward, with a gloved hand poised near one's bosom, as the other retrieved the vinaigrette with calculated drama. Vinegar, Charlotte thought years later, tamed more than odor. It managed the men. In a world where a lady's worth was tied to her complexion, her carriage, and her conversation, vinegar offered invisible support. It masked the scent of nervousness, steadied the senses in overly warm dining halls, and added just enough drama to maintain mystique. As the Georgian years ripened and turned musty with age, the etiquette changed, but the objects endured. Some vinaigrettes were passed down through families not for their scent, but for the memories locked within the silver. Charlotte's had been gifted by her aunt, engraved with lilies. Inside, the sponge was long, dry, but she kept it. It lived. On a shelf with her old gloves and crumbling playbills, a silent relic of her younger performances, of glittering gowns and careful gestures, of dances she once thought might never end. The use of vinegar was not entirely frivolous. Physicians occasionally prescribed vinegar to counter noxious airs, a lingering belief from miasma theory. In crowded ballrooms, thick with candle smoke and sweaty brocade, the scent was thought to purify, though incorrect by modern standards. There was something almost practical in the instinct to Charlotte and her peers. A vinaigrette was a silent boundary. It granted a moment of personal space in a world where women's bodies were tightly managed, both physically and socially. A sniff could provide distance. A waft could excuse a turn away. In parlors, vinegar served other purposes. Hostesses would scent rooms with vinegar tinctures in bowls, believing they protected guests from catching colds. Others dabbed their necklines before greeting visitors. In times of mourning, widows were encouraged to carry vinegar-laced cloths, believed to calm the nerves and reduce fits of despair. The act became ritualized, passed along with recipes and lace cuffs. One elder matron was said to judge the quality of a suitor by whether he flinched at the scent of rosemary vinegar. If he winces, she warned her granddaughter, he will never withstand your opinions. By the time Charlotte reached her 40s, the use of vinaigrettes had quietly faded from popularity. Society changed. Parties became less ceremonial, more practical. New beliefs about hygiene and health arrived. Soap improved, corsets loosened, ballrooms were better ventilated. Yet for those who remembered, the gesture remained. Charlotte would occasionally find herself raising her hand as if to open the long-vanished vinaigrette. It was a ghost movement, one born of habit, a muscle memory of dignity. One summer, her niece found the old vinaigrette while dusting. She brought it to Charlotte with the curiosity of someone who had never needed one. "What is this little box?" she asked. Charlotte smiled and gently opened it. The sponge inside had hardened like a fossil. She inhaled faintly and caught the ghost of lavender, or perhaps memory. "It was how we held ourselves together," she whispered, "one sniff at a time." And so, the bottle became more than an object. It was a symbol of the quiet ways women managed the unbearable, while men rode horses into war or shouted across chambers. The ladies of the Georgian era sniffed vinegar and survived the evening stiffed bath. Story 3. Why Georgian women sniffed vinegar before parties. Section 1. Bottles on the mantel. The secret sense. The light in the drawing room was soft that evening, filtered through lace curtains and catching on the polished silver bell by the hearth. The air smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender water, and something sharper, almost sour. You might not notice it at first, but if you sat still long enough, you'd catch it. The tang of vinegar, faint and clinging. It drifted not from the kitchen, but from the glass bottle, resting delicately on the mantelpiece, stoppered in crystal and wrapped in ribbon. It was not a cleaning supply. It was not a mistake. It was a fashion in the Georgian era-cross parlors. In London, Bath, and country estates alike, it was considered both stylish and necessary for a lady to carry a small vial of scented vinegar. These were not the vinegar bottles you might imagine, used for dressing lettuce or preserving onions. No, these were vinaigrettes, delicate, perfumed, and purposeful, worn like jewelry, held like a secret. You see, the world outside those powdery drawing rooms was far less fragrant. The streets of 18th century England and much of Europe reeked of damp refuse, chamber pots, coal smoke, and rotting food. Perfume could mask the scent of a person, but it could not hold back the city. So Georgian women and, later, gentlemen, too turned to vinegar, infused with herbs and essential oils. As a remedy, they carried it in tiny silver cases lined with sponge, which could be discreetly opened and held beneath the nose. Just a gentle sniff, enough to push back the worst of the world. These were known as smelling salts, though they contained no ammonia-y sharp, herbal vinegar designed to refresh the senses, clear the head, and restore composure. Some were shaped like lockets, worn on silk ribbons around the neck. Others hid in reticules, among fans and lace gloves. A few rested openly on side tables, meant to be admired as much as used. The vinaigrettes themselves were miniature works of art, engraved, filigreed, chased in gold. Owning a fine one was a subtle display of taste and means. But there was another reason these scented vinegars were kept so close. Not just for odor, but for fainting. Georgian society was tightly lacedly tradely. Corsets pulled tight over linen chemises, layered with petticoats, embroidered bodices, and powdered wigs. A fashionable woman might spend over an hour preparing her attire, every ribbon and ringlet placed just so. But all this beauty came at a price: shallow breaths, overheated skin, and, at times, dizziness. In such moments, standing for hours at a crowded salon, dancing in a stuffy ballroom, sitting beside a roaring fire in layers of brocade faintness was not uncommon. To swoon was not always a sign of weakness. Sometimes it was a mark of refinement, but to recover quickly, that required preparation. The vinaigrette, with its sharp temps, served as both antidote and accessory. You can imagine the scene: a young lady pale from heat, a gentleman rushing to her side, a silver vinaigrette opened with care and held beneath her nose. She breathes in deeply, a pause, a flutter of eyelashes, and then, as though on cue, she returns to herself, fresh-stored, composed, and politely apologetic. There were even etiquette guides on how to revive a lady without impropriety. One must never touch her too much, one must not lift her skirts, and one must never, ever apply water directly to her face unless truly necessary. Vinegar was the safe choice: respectful, refined, and just strong enough to bring a lady back from the edge. Doctors, too, had their opinions. In an age where miasmas, the invisible bad airs, were blamed for everything from colds to cholera, vinegar was seen as a purifier. Hospitals used it to cleanse wounds. Households soaked cloths in it during outbreaks. And in upper-class circles, vinaigrettes became a protective charm against both social embarrassment and invisible illness. The recipes varied. Some women favored lavender and rosemary. Others preferred cinnamon and clove. A few, daringly, added hints of camphor or bergamot. But the base was always the same: good vinegar wine or cider, never malt distilled and strained, then steeped with dried herbs. The result was both medicinal and personal, tailored to taste. In Bath, the fashionable elite would visit apothecaries for their own signature blends. Shopkeepers offered shelves lined with ornate bottles, labeled in looping script: vinegar, a la duchesse, the lady's reviving elixir, lemon balm for the faint of heart. Prices varied, of course. A simple bottle might cost a few shillings. A custom-crafted vinaigrette, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, several pounds in name in the gossip papers. It became a ritual. Before stepping into a carriage, a lady might dab a drop behind each ear. Before entering a party, she might check her bottle, adjust her gloves, and breathe in the comfort of something sharp and familiar. It steadied the nerves. It masked the world. It was her shield, and it wasn't just the women. Gentlemen carried vinaigrettes too, more discreetly. A fop might pull one from his waistcoat, inhaling before stepping into a crowded club. A politician might use one during a long debate, masking the smell of sweat and ink. Even soldiers were known to keep a sponge bottle tucked into their packs, the scent of rosemary and vinegar reminding them of home. But no one displayed them, quite like the women of the Georgian drawing rooms. There, nestled beside fans, opera glasses, and sachets of dried rose petals, a whisper of vinegar on the air, a flash of silver in a gloved hand, a faint, sharp scent amid powder and perfume. Why did they sniff vinegar before parties? Because it kept them upright, because it masked what society preferred not to see, because beauty, it seemed, required a little discomfort. And because, beneath all the lace and etiquette, the women of the Georgian era knew how to survive quietly, gracefully, and with a bottle hidden in plain sight. But what happened when vinegar wasn't enough? When the world outside grew fouler? Then scent could disguise, and fainting became not a fashion, but a warning. By mid-morning, the west market of Chang'an bloomed like a fabric unfurling in slow wind. Silk banners danced from rooftop poles, each dyed in hues that only poets dared name: apricot dusk, cloud shadow blue, persimmon blush. Perfumes curled into the air, braided with the earthy scent of sandalwood, the peppery bite of crushed star anise, and the soft, familiar warmth of roasted millet cakes being turned on open pans. Lanway's stall sat quietly beneath a yellow awning embroidered with 3 plum blossoms, their threads slightly faded from years of sun. He had paid for the space seasonally with a percentage of his best spring harvest, and in return the market guards let him open early and close late. They knew he would not haggle beyond reason, nor water down his brew. In truth, most of them had wives who swore by his jasmine tea for sleep, and so the arrangement carried its own kind of silent loyalty. He moved carefully behind the lacquered counter, arranging cups on a stone slab whose corners had been smoothed by years of wiping. Each vessel was different: a cracked celadon bowl, a blue and white cup with a chip near the lip, and a plain round dish no bigger than a coin. Each had its story. Each had served 1,000 strangers and a few friends. Around him, the market pulsed. A silk trader from Sogdia argued loudly with a cinnamon merchant whose scales leaned too easily in his favor. A woman in red robes held a baby on her hip and reached with her other hand to taste an unfamiliar candied root. Buddhist monks passed through, silent but smiling, with their alms bowls lightly tapping against their walking staffs. Nearby, a puppeteer set up his screen, readying shadow animals to leap across the silk backdrop at noon. Lanway's eyes rested briefly on a crate of dried chrysanthemum buds, pale and clustered like sleeping bees. These he would steep later, for the scholar who visited after lunch, the one who never bought more than a handful but always left with a story. He loved the man's tales, especially the ones about ships with paper sails and goats who could climb trees. Even if half were dreams, they steeped better than most truths. A customer appeared, an older woman with ink on her fingers and pine ash on her sleeves, likely a calligrapher or a widow who burned joss sticks too often. She asked for yellow tea, the kind that tasted like warm hay and quiet thoughts. Lanway brewed it carefully, pouring from a small height to let the air cool the stream. As she sipped, she asked nothing more. Some clients were like that. They needed the silence more than the leaf. In the lull between mid-morning and noon, Lanway opened his ledger. It was not full of numbers, but names. May, who bought green curls for her uncle's nerves. Jo, who always came with coins sewn into her sleeve hem. And old Han, who hadn't appeared in 3 weeks, which meant either his gout had returned or he'd run out of stories. Either way, Lanway added a mark beside his name, not for debt, but for memory. A shout rang out: a trader from the south had arrived with dried lychees and rumors of a tax on river tea. Lanway listened with one ear, though he paid it no great worry. River tea rarely reached the markets of Chang'an without first tasting mold and losing its fragrance. His own harvests, sourced from the high, mist-fed terraces in the subtropical hills, carried enough scent to quiet even the loudest tongues. A small girl wandered by and touched a cup. Landway knelt, showed her how the clay stayed warm even after the tea was gone. She giggled and ran off, and he returned to his seat, cross-legged behind his wares. All around him, the market teemed. Carp flapped in bamboo baskets. Coins clinked in hidden pockets. Pigeons flurried overhead like untied thoughts. But in the middle of it all, the tea stall remained calm, an island of quiet brewing, fragrant patience, and the soft rhythm of water just beginning to boil. Story 14. A Day in the Life of a Tang Dynasty Tea Merchant. Section 3. The Tea That Traveled. Without a map asterisk, the crates had been packed with the reverence one might reserve for scrolls of law or painted relics of silk. Tea pressed, curled, and powdered was swaddled in mulberry paper, tied with hemp string, and sealed with wax, bearing the faint imprint of the merchant's name, Lubai of Shangyuan Lane. Each package held more than leaf and scent. It held a measure of trust, a memory of spring harvests, and the careful timing of boiling water. When the caravan finally arrived, swaying under morning haze, Bai did not wave or call out. He simply exhaled, as though he'd been holding his breath. For a fortnight, the men who drove the camels wore robes, bleached pale from long days under the Gobi sun. Their mouths were chapped, their voices sanded down into something more gesture than sound. Yet, when Bai offered them a bowl of weak tea lukewarm, almost ceremonial, they smiled with something that looked like home. They did not need words. The taste said, "You made it." So did I trade during the Tang Dynasty was never a straight road. There were too many forks, too many mountains, too many bribes to be paid quietly under the table made of apricot wood. The Silk Road, for all its romantic names, was mostly dust and foot blisters, ledgers smudged by travel-worn fingers, and messages sent by errand boys who sometimes forgot where they were going. Tea, like news, traveled slow but steady, once every month. Bai would light a candle by the south-facing window of his storehouse and unfurl the records kept by his cousin when in Dunhuang, written in the soft curve of clerical tent calligraphy. The scrolls documented not just quantities and weights, but impressions. New buyer in Kashgar has a fondness for smoky flavor. Or, mule collapsed at river crossing, lost 1 barrel of green tea. Surviving batch, steeped bitter. By wood, trace the words, as if stroking the weathered back of an old friend. Not all shipments made it. Bandits or poor decisions. Once, Bai had sent a particularly delicate jasmine blend to Samarkand, sealed tight in ceramic jars. A year later, he received a chipped jar with only tea dust inside and a note in broken Chinese. Good flavor, send again. He had smiled. Then, a failure perhaps, but a flattering one. Back home, customers rarely thought about how far their tea had traveled. The scholar who sipped oolong while reciting poetry to a turtle had no notion of the storm his leaves had endured. The grandmother boiling red tea with dried plum in a soot-streaked kitchen did not ponder trade routes, but by dead, always he sometimes dreamed of those roads, woke to the phantom creak of a caravan passing outside his window, though the street was empty. Sometimes he thought he could smell desert dust, sharp and bright, clinging to the hem of his sleeping robe. As autumn turned to winter, Bai began preparing for the next round of shipments. He had a new batch of tea bricks pressed with the emblem of a phoenix, an emblem he thought would impress buyers in Chang'an's outer districts. His daughter Ling practiced stamping the seal on practice sheets of rice paper. She giggled when it came out crooked, but did not correct her. He just watched and nodded, allowing her hands to find the rhythm on their own. At dusk, Bai would often linger by the rows of jars, breathing in each one like it was a song. The green, the black, the yellow, the faint perfume of osmanthus and lotus. They no longer surprised him. Some were destined to travel halfway across the empire. Others would never leave the shop, but all of them mattered. The lantern outside the tea shop swung gently in the breeze, its light dulling against the darkening sky. Bai lit a final stick of incense, not out of devotion, but habit. The road might not be visible tonight, but it was still there, dusty, winding, and filled with tea.